But again, coming back to the novel as a form, the novel can hold all these disciplines and much more. That's why I feel very sad when, some people say, I don't have time to read fiction. I read important things because so much is happening in the world. So I read about finance and technology, the big stuff. That makes me really sad because I don't have time for fiction means I don't have time for emotions.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this Mishcon Academy session in conversation with Elif Shafak, a voice of our time. This is part of a series run by the Academy of online events, podcasts and videos looking at some of the biggest issues that are facing communities, individuals and businesses today. My name is Matthew Carpenter. I'm the EDI and Engagement Manager here at Mishcon, and I'll be hosting today's event. So I'm now on to the fun part. I'm very excited to introduce award-winning British-Turkish novelist and storyteller Elif Shafak. Elif, welcome to Mishcon, or should I say welcome back to Mishcon?
Well, thank you so much. Wonderful to be back.
It's so having previously read one of Elif's novels, I'm really excited to be interviewing today. There is, however, another superfan amongst us who actually had a birthday cake in the shape of one of your books. So you've got a big fan base here at Mishcon. So we're here today to talk about your latest novel, which is There Are Rivers in the Sky. For those of you that haven't had the chance to read it yet, this novel weaves together the stories of one lost poem, two great rivers, and three remarkable lives, which are all linked through a single drop of water. In the book, it explores themes of belonging, displacement, relationships, memories, identity, and highlighting and uncovering a whole host of different traditions and voices of marginalised groups throughout centuries and continents and cultures. So everyone strap in because we've got a lot to cover in the next hour. So Elif, I wonder whether we start today by talking about that single drop of water that ties it all together, and we follow the life cycle of that water with it landing on the head of King Ashurbanipal thousands of years ago. So what inspired you to start the story in this way and also actually write about something as seemingly insignificant as a drop of water?
Yeah, what a beautiful question. I really appreciate every word. I think, it might seem like an epic novel, epic in the sense that, as you kind of said, it does span centuries and cultures and continents. But actually, everything came to me with a very small idea, and that idea was this single drop of water, the raindrop, which just landed on my hand as I was walking by the river one day. But it was almost like a spiritual question, one that maybe William Blake asked centuries ago. Can we see a whole world inside a grain of sand? Can we take something as seemingly small and insignificant as a drop of water and try to see its story, the universe that it hides? And I say this not in a perhaps abstract way. I say it as someone, as a writer, as a novelist who comes from the Middle East. Yeah, I'm Turkish originally. And this is important because today, out of the most 10 water-stressed nations in the world, 7 are in the Middle East and in North Africa. So for us, water crisis is not some theoretical, abstract debate. It is an acute reality. Sometimes in Europe, we forget that climate crisis is primarily water crisis. We're talking about freshwater scarcity. We forget it because, understandably, sea levels are rising everywhere and there are flash floods. So it gives us the illusion that there's an abundance of water all around. And the irony is, amidst this abundance, there isn't enough water to drink. And because we see our rivers are dying, they're drying up, I also want to perhaps connect the dots. This has consequences for everyone, but particularly for women. Young women usually are water carriers. They bring water to their communities. When there's no drinkable water nearby, the distance that a young woman has to walk increases, unfortunately increasing the possibility for gender violence. And these are important because we put them in separate boxes, like this is the box for climate crisis, this is the box for water scarcity, this is the box for gender inequality or racial inequality, but actually everything is connected. And I think water reminds us that we are all connected.
Yeah, and I think the importance of water is really seen in that book and connects everything. And there's a really lovely quote that talks around the fact that you describe trees as rooted water, streams as flowing water, birds as flying water, and humans as warring water, never at peace. And that relationship between humans and water is something you sort of play with throughout the book, and you describe water as having human qualities, and also water and the reverse, and humans having water qualities with the flow of our emotions, and the rivers within us are both good and evil.
Yeah.
What do you hope to achieve by bringing to light that connection between humans and water?
Yeah, I really find this important because we need to talk about this fluid nature of being human. And in an age in which we are constantly pushed into boxes and attributed some labels and told to stay in our own boxes once and for all, I think it's really important to remember how fluid we are by nature. We're always learning, changing, becoming. Right? That's the beauty, that's the challenge of being human. But also, we're all multiple. We all contain multitudes, like the poet Walt Whitman told us. The problem is we're living in a world that doesn't allow us to celebrate our own multiplicity. We're being told that diversity is a problem, multiplicity is a burden, that it's better and safer if we're surrounded by sameness. That's a myth, that's an illusion. So I think as human beings, we learn from differences. That's what challenges us, intellectually, spiritually. So there's a part of me that wants to also celebrate that multiplicity and the fluid nature of being human.
And one of the really interesting things that I think the qualities that you give water is, and you talk about it a lot through the book, is the memory of water. And the idea that I think the fourth section actually is called Memories of Water. And there's a quote within the book that says, "Water remembers, it's the humans who forget." What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, the very opening of the book is this little raindrop lands on the head of a very mighty king called Ashurbanipal, as you pointed out. Let us remember that he was the most cultured and educated, intellectual king that the Assyrian Empire had ever seen. That doesn't mean that he was less cruel than his predecessors. And ever since that moment in time, so many mighty kings have come and gone, so many empires have crumbled, so much has happened. And if we can remember, if we can have a memory of the past, I think we won't make the same mistakes. And yet, as human beings, we never learn. We have an illusion of a linear time that tells us tomorrow is going to be more progressive, more developed than yesterday. There's no such guarantee. We like to believe that the arc of history is going to bend towards justice. That is words. When you follow the story of a river, of a mountain, of a tree, then it makes you pause. Is time really linear, or is it more cyclical? Is it, for instance, let us look at the history of, very briefly, the River Thames, beautiful river that shapes this very city that we live in. It's a zombie, isn't it? Because it was dead not that long ago. It was biologically declared dead. Why? Because of the way we human beings mistreated the river. It was full of such filth that no biospecies could live inside this water. And yet what the river did was to renew itself, recreate itself. And today it's home to more than 200 biospecies, which is a miracle. And even though we have to admire this, what we're doing today is what water companies are doing in the name of greed, in the name of profit, and money, they're pumping sewage back again into the same river. So when you follow the journey of one river, is really history linear? It makes you question.
Definitely. I think we've talked about water, but now I think it'd be useful to just introduce us very briefly to the three characters. So we've got these three characters that are connected by the water. So in 1840s London, we meet Arthur, who's born in poverty in the slums of London by the river Thames. We then jump to 2014 in Turkey. We meet Narin, who is a young Yazidi girl being raised by the river Tigris by her grandmother Beshma. And then we also have a slight leap to 2018, where we're back in London and we meet Zakila, who is a hydrologist who's moved to a houseboat on the River Thames after a divorce. So within the book, you describe these characters to begin with and their interactions as a water molecule, so H2O. Can you share with us what you hope to achieve through that?
Yes, so I mean, each and every one of them is very different, of course, but I'm hoping by the end of the book, they will all surprisingly come together. So Arthur is my oxygen. Maybe I can say a few words about him and maybe about the others separately. He's actually based on an actual historical figure. Of course, my character is imaginary. I call him in the book King Arthur of the Sewers and the Slums. And there's a reason why he's given this unusual name. But he's loosely based on a person called George Smith, who was also born in Chelsea at the time, in the slum tenements of Chelsea, into severe poverty. And I think had he been alive today, we would have recognized the beauty of his mind, the neurodivergence of his mind, and we would have respected this. But of course, at the time, he gets no such recognition. And this boy grows up in extreme poverty and suffering. I had to dream up a childhood and youth for him because we don't know much about his past. But at some point, he comes to the British Museum, and purely by the power of his visual memory, he looks at these shattered, broken clay tablets brought over from the Middle East, which is another subject. But then he starts piecing them together little by little. But we're talking about thousands and thousands of shards that he pieces together. And he starts to decode the cuneiform, and he decodes the flood tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is a major, major discovery. And this guy is a very shy, he's an introvert, he's a very timid human being. So he finds himself in the middle of a very heated debate between science and religion. Because what he finds is a story that goes like this. There's an ark, or there's a coracle. On board this coracle, there are animals, there are human beings. They're surrounded by water, a deluge, and they're looking for land. The story is very familiar, isn't it? It's so similar to the story of Noah's Ark in the Old Testament. But the difference is this was written thousands of years before the Bible and the Old Testament. So people who are religious, they would say, well, you see, it proves that the Holy Book is right. It really happened. But people who were more scientific at the time, they would say, it proves that as humanity, we've been telling ourselves the same old stories over and over. And that's a very heated debate, not only in the UK or across Europe, but also on the other side of the Atlantic, in the US as well. And he finds himself in the middle of this debate. He comes to the Middle East twice to find the missing lines in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in that section, 17 lines he's looking for. And he loses his life there. He's buried today between Turkey and Syria in a forgotten graveyard. And a part of me wanted to honor this very unusual Victorian scholar and genius.
And in the story, when we meet Arthur, we have a brief and surprising cameo from Charles Dickens. And we see him as a flustered yet very kind man who inspires and influences Arthur. Can you sort of share why you brought in this historic figure to the story?
I love Dickens. I mean, like many authors, I've been, I felt his impact on me, on my own literary journeys. But I think when we look at each section of this book, the style changes a little bit. I always believe that every story brings its own style, you know, its own rhythm and language. So the parts that take place in Victorian London are a bit more Dickensian. And the parts that where I describe the Yazidi girl who lives in Turkey with her grandmother, there are more dialogues in that part because this is a culture that mostly relies on oral storytelling. They don't have a written book. Everything depends on oral stories. And the third part where I talk about the water scientist who's studying buried rivers is more like contemporary modern novel. So the style varies, but I very much enjoy trying to the best of my ability, capture the Dickensian tone.
And before we move on to those the hydrogen molecules and the next characters, I think one thing that's really interesting is that you explore through Arthur and his relationship with his employer, the British Museum. You see, and you also see throughout the book with others interactions with museums and also historical artifacts, is the sort of connected themes around colonialism, exploitation, and theft. This obviously is a debate that you can sort of see through the lens of different viewpoints through those interactions. But as you grow with Arthur, you see him as a boy that's very enamoured by it and very excited by it. And then as he progresses through his life, he's then more very critical, a more critical perspective. Could you, and again, we could probably spend the entire hour talking about this topic in particular, but could you summarise what you hoped to achieve by sharing this narrative and how that contributes to the debate?
Yeah, I really appreciate that we're talking about this. It's such a delicate subject, it's a complex subject, and it's so important. And social media is not the place to discuss this. You know, literature is, because in literature there's room for pluralism, there's room for nuance and for calmness. I think our museums need to engage in this debate. They cannot say, well, you know, our doors are open to everyone and whoever wants to come, they can visit these cultural artifacts. How many people can even get a visa? We need to talk about how, for instance, right now we're focusing on the artifacts brought over from the Middle East, more specifically from Iraq, Syria, Nineveh, for instance. How did they end up here? This was not a smooth transition. So many artifacts were broken, lost, plundered, stolen on the way. At the bottom of the river Tigris, there are lamassu sculptures. There are clay tablets. Why? Because while they were being carried over, they sunk. We never talk about this. We never learn about these things. And I think museums need a new narrative. They need to be more positive, constructive, but we need to be able to talk about colonial history and how these artifacts ended up here and all these lost and buried truths, you know? But I am, as I mentioned, a Turkish writer. If I'm talking about British colonial past, I also need to talk about the Ottoman authorities. What were they doing? That kind of ignorance and destruction of cultural heritage is a layer that in Turkey we never talk about. So that's another layer. And then we need to talk about ISIS. ISIS extremist militants, how they destroyed cultural heritage not only in Syria and Iraq, in a very deliberate way, but also behind the scenes while they were filming this barbaric videos, behind the scenes they were also selling these artifacts and making enormous amounts of profit out of this, to such an extent that at some point in London on Portobello Road, there were artifacts from Syria being sold on the street, you know? So this illicit trafficking of artifacts, ISIS also made a lot of money out of this. So that's then another layer. That's why we need to be calmer. And that's one of the many reasons why I love the novel as a form so much, because you can hold multiple thoughts inside a novel, unlike a place like Twitter.
Yeah, definitely. So moving on to our next character, we meet Narin. At this point in 2014, we're in Turkey. She is a young Yazidi girl with a rare hearing condition, and she's being raised by the River Tigris by her grandmother Beshma. And as someone whose 81-year-old grandmother joined LinkedIn so she could like and watch this episode, this session, I've got a big sort of soft spot for Narin and her grandmother, and I believe this actually is based upon your own grandmother and that relationship. Can you sort of share a bit about her and how this inspired the characters of Narin and Beshma?
Yeah, and may I send my love from here to your grandmother? Yeah, we love grandmothers. I was raised by a grandmother myself until I was about 10 years old, and she really shaped me in so many ways. She shaped my writing as well. Very briefly, maybe I say a few things about my own story too. I was born in France, and my parents got separated, and I came to Turkey with my mom. At the time, my mother was very young. You know, she had dropped out of university. Therefore, she had no diploma as a young divorcee, no career, nothing to fall back on. And I remember, like the neighborhood, they see a young divorcee almost as a threat, right? The patriarchal order, and immediately they try to find an older husband to take care of. And it was my grandmother who intervened, and she said, no, my daughter should go back to university, and I'll raise my granddaughter until her mother is ready. It was very unusual, my upbringing in that regard. And it really changed our lives. My grandmother was not a very well-educated woman, only because she had been pulled out of school for being a girl, and she wholeheartedly believed in women's education and independence. And because she supported her daughter's independence, the impact of that solidarity and sisterhood, I think, goes beyond generations. So I see traces of my own grandmother in the character of Besma. But I want to say a few words about the Yazidis, if I may. This is one of the most persecuted, misunderstood, and maligned minorities in the world. The Yazidi lore, because it's mostly based on oral storytelling, the Yazidi lore talks about 72 massacres day by day, you know. They keep the memory. And the 73rd happened, the genocide initiated against the Yazidi minority, was, of course, started by ISIS fanatics in 2014. But maybe not many people noticed that the very first thing that ISIS did was to kill the water. So they poisoned all the wells and fountains, leaving no drinkable water for entire communities. And the second thing they did was to kill the elderly. In a community like the Yazidis, where memory is kept by the older generation, if you kill an entire older generation, you're killing collective memory. If you kill collective memory, you kill collective identity. They killed defenseless men, and then they kidnapped women and children. And as we're speaking, there are still more than 3,000 women We don't know their whereabouts. They're turned into sex slaves, kept in quote-unquote ordinary neighborhoods across the Middle East. Purely by coincidence, while I was writing this book, one of these women was saved in a house in Ankara, in the neighborhood where I grew up, my maternal grandmother's house, 2 streets away. And it really struck me hard, because how is it possible that a human being is kept under these circumstances in a tight-knit community, and the entire neighborhood doesn't hear or doesn't see or doesn't know? So there's a lot of numbness and indifference going on, and I think that's also part of the problem.
Yep. And I think with the stories that you share in terms of that chaos and the persecution of Narin's story, there are some beautiful moments with the grandma being the storyteller, the memory keeper, and you've almost taken up the mantle of that role as author, as storyteller, and almost archaeologist of some of the customs, traditions, and stories and histories, almost at the point of being extinct, and sharing those within that book. One of those stories that really, I think, really sticks out and sort of encapsulates that is the book, within the book is a story of, is it Nisaba, the goddess of writing? And throughout history, she was the goddess of writing, and she was stripped of her powers and accolades, and they were handed to a male god, and then she was then transmuted from the goddess of writing, and then seen as his wife, seen as his secretary, and then sort of disappeared. Are you able to share perhaps a bit more about that history and why you included that in this text?
Yeah, really, really appreciate. So as we go back in time, of course, there's a direct relationship between the way we, as humanity, the way we invented writing and agriculture, right? They went hand in hand. So when you trace it back thousands of years ago, it is one goddess that represents both in the Middle East, and her name is Nisaba. She has multiple other names, but Nisaba is the most common one. And over time, she becomes the goddess of literature, literacy, libraries. At scribal schools where students learn to write on clay tablets, her name is written at the entrance. Many tablets are finished by saying, "Praise be to Nisaba." So she represents the art of storytelling, but also harvest, fertility, as I said, agriculture, and so on. As patriarchy becomes more and more consolidated, slowly Nisaba is pushed aside. And then you start seeing a male god called Nabu takes over her skills. Nabu becomes the god of writing and literacy and literature. And where's Nisaba? In the drawings, Nisaba is in the background. She becomes the faithful wife of Nabu, and then she becomes the secretary to Nabu, and then she disappears completely. Later on, Nabu affects Greek and Roman civilizations, so you can see in various gods the traces of Nabu. So scholars can see the continuity from Nabu towards Greek gods and Roman gods. But whereas Nisaba, she stays in the region and completely forgotten, and almost no one remembers her. So it seemed important to me to finish this book by saying praise be to Nisaba.
Absolutely. And then finally, we will move across to our final sort of hydrogen atom. So we have Zalika, who is a hydrologist who has moved to the houseboat on the River Thames after a divorce, and she is there seeking solace, meaning, and she's grappling with identity. Can you sort of introduce her to us and her importance as that final piece of the atom?
Yeah, thank you so much. So Zeliha is a child of immigrants. As you mentioned at the beginning of the book, she's going through a rough period in her life. She lives in a houseboat in Chelsea, exactly the spot where George Smith or Arthur was born. 100 years later, Chelsea is a very different world right now. And she's studying buried rivers, lost rivers. As you know, London is very much shaped by lost rivers, right? The biggest rivers in our planet are the invisible rivers, meaning atmospheric rivers. And then, of course, there are so many rivers under our feet. And not only London, but New York is very much shaped by buried rivers. So is Moscow, Tokyo, Stuttgart, Athens, beautiful Athens. You go there, it feels like there are no rivers. Of course there are. Where are they? Under the ground. 3 rivers in one city, but we don't see them. So what we did as humanity, as we built our cities, we declared some rivers insignificant, too dirty, unnecessary, and we covered them. And we built roads above them. We built our buildings above them. And now, with the sea levels rising and the climate crisis, that system is not sustainable anymore. That's why we're seeing more and more flash floods, because the rivers that we buried cannot carry this much water. So they will burst. Right? So there is now awareness across the world. In Paris, because Paris has another very important buried river, Bièvre. There's a movement now. They call it daylighting, bringing these buried rivers into daylight. There's an important example of this in Seoul, in South Korea. They've done it very successfully. As a writer, for me, it's also an important metaphor, because I want to ask what else is buried in our lives, in our societies, in our cultures. Can we bring them to daylight? Can we talk about the silences as well as the stories?
And through this character, without giving too many spoilers, and throughout your work, there is LGBTQ plus representation and characters. How important to you is that to include, and also particularly perhaps within the current social climate that we have and our conversation earlier, to include those representations?
Yeah, indeed. I think we're living in very liquid times, not that long ago, many scholars, experts used to divide the world almost into solid lands and liquid lands. In late 1990s, the early noughties, and there was this assumption that if you are in one of these solid lands in the West, you don't have to worry about human rights, democracy, freedom of speech, or LGBTQ plus rights, because these things have already been achieved, right? We're beyond that. But you have to worry about these things in the liquid lands over there. That arrogant and dualistic perception of the world, I think, is shattered now, isn't it? Now we know that there's no such thing as solid lands versus liquid lands. In fact, we're all going through liquid times. And what that means is there is no guarantee. There's nothing, we can't say, oh, this has been achieved, so we don't have to worry about that. I think we all need to worry more. I'm not saying let's be pessimistic, but let's keep the mind awake, alert. And I think women's rights or minority rights are under threat across the world. And whenever we see a country starting to go backwards, these two will be the very first rights that will be taken away. It will be women's rights and minority rights. History shows us this pattern. So I think, to me, this has always been an important subject. It's very visible in my writing, but it was only recently I gave a TED Talk. I gave 2 TED Global talks. It was in the second TED Global talk that I was able to say that it's also my story. I am bisexual, and this was something that I found very difficult to talk about. And after I gave that talk, I received a lot of verbal abuse and hate speech for about 2.5 months, uninterrupted, from Turkey, not from anywhere else. That was sad for me to see, but I also received every now and then a letter from maybe some mother, some parent, or some young person saying thank you, for sharing the story. So all I'm trying to say is I think it's a very crucial time for global solidarity, and especially for global sisterhood and for minority rights.
Definitely. And one thing that also I think is an interesting sort of theme, perhaps topic that comes up, is the idea of imposter syndrome. And perhaps almost all your characters look at that. And I've seen mostly, go back to the first character on Arthur, when he is sharing and presenting his ideas to scholars, to professionals coming from the slums. Is that something that you have experienced yourself, or is that something that you thought a really important thing to include and weave throughout your stories?
Yeah, what a brilliant question. We have so much self-doubt, and I think self-doubt up to a certain point is such a healthy thing, we need it, but we also need to have the faith. What seems unfair to me is that if you happen to be a young man from a disadvantaged background, like for instance Arthur in the story, if you happen to be an immigrant, if you happen to be, for this reason or that reason, someone who doesn't fit this image of what a successful person is, we constantly doubt ourselves, and sometimes that turns into a nagging voice inside. I think we need to be very careful about that. If I may share one very brief example, I used to go to schools a lot across the Middle East to give talks, because I wrote a children's book in Turkey, which gave me a chance to observe or to talk to very young readers, like I'm talking about 6 or 7 years old. Yeah, if you speak to a young Turkish child or a Jordanian or an Egyptian child, they are no different whatsoever from a Canadian, French, Norwegian. At that age, children have so much chutzpah, so much creativity. Like, ask in a room full of young students, are there any artists here? So many hands go up. They're already artists. They have no doubt. Are there any writers here? Hands up. Poets? Hands up. And then ask the same question to 17-year-olds, 16-year-olds in the same city, in the same country. Are there any artists here? No hands go up. No poets, no novelists. What happened? What happened was, I think, and girls become timid. So 16-year-old, 17-year-old girls are very, very timid to speak up. Why? Because as a society, we teach, be careful, how you laugh, how you sit down, even the tone of your voice, the length of your skirt, everything is going to be judged. And little by little, we start to internalize that judging gaze to such an extent that when we look at ourselves in the mirror, we don't need an external voice anymore. We see ourselves through that gaze, through that voice. And then we're not pretty enough. And then we're not clever enough. We're not this enough. But who says that? Which voice says that? All I'm saying is we need to dismantle that voice and just remember the confidence and creativity that we all had naturally as children.
One thing I think was really interesting and perhaps creative in the book is the fact that it is a book of fiction, but within the book you have lots of pictures of the actual artifacts, which is obviously more prevalent in the non-fiction books and actually the museums themselves. So you see the Lamassus, you see the written tablets of Gilgamesh, you see depictions of King Ashurbanipal. What were the reason that you included these images within your book?
Yes, I think I was a little bit inspired by the Victorian era. Many novels at the time, of course, contained images, and we lost that. We think that if a book is serious, if it's serious literary fiction, it will not have any pictures. Why not, right? But basically, I think I'm very interested in interdisciplinary thinking. My own background in academia is also a bit interdisciplinary. I genuinely believe we need to leave our comfort zones a little bit in everything we do in life. Yeah. So to me, it's much more interesting if a novelist becomes curious about physics or neuroscience or water science. I don't know anything about these fields, but I want to learn. I want to be curious. So you become a student of life. But if the same scientist could become interested in film theory, or a director could become interested in poetry, or a poet in political philosophy, the moment we leave our compartmentalized zones and start to engage in other fields, other disciplines, I think that's when the mind is much more nourished. But again, coming back to the novel as a form, the novel can hold all these disciplines and much more. That's why I feel very sad when, some people say, I don't have time to read fiction. I read important things because so much is happening in the world. So I read about finance and technology, the big stuff. That makes me really sad because I don't have time for fiction means I don't have time for emotions. It means I don't have time for emotional intelligence. I don't know a single human being who does not need to connect with their emotions. Whatever we do in life, dentists, students, designers, teachers, we all have to deal with our own emotions, other people's emotions, especially in this age, which is the age of anxiety. It's the age of angst. It's an age in which emotions dominate, right? So fiction gives us a very different kind of knowledge, wisdom. It's very unfortunate that in the English language we use it as the opposite of fact, but I think fiction brings us closer to truth. So that kind of multiplicity and bringing interdisciplinary thinking is very close to my heart.
And the fact within your fiction, you can link it so much to the fact is because you've got a hydrologist as one of your main characters and someone working at a museum. One of the things that I obviously, and you've spoken a little bit about it, is in terms of the zombie rivers and the bringing daylighting. In London, do we have lost rivers?
So many under our feet. I mean, even Sloane Square, right? Every time you travel through Sloane Square, imagine if we lift our heads, we can see almost a skeleton of one of those lost rivers, of course, covered just above our heads, under Buckingham Palace, and everywhere, from Westbourne Grove, every neighborhood. This city in particular is very much shaped by lost rivers.
And is there plans to daylight any of those rivers that are in London?
There are some plans. One other thing that is very much, shapes the story of London is mudlarking, as you know. So there's all these stories about buried rivers, but also mudlarking, which is because the Thames is such a tidal river, right? Every day you can observe the movement of the river, the ebb and tide. So people who are mudlarkers for centuries, they look for artifacts, for the things that the river brings us, for the discarded items. There are some artists who make jewelry from the pieces that they find as they were mudlarking. So it's very open to creativity as well.
And throughout the book, you cover so many different topics that we've talked through today. Was there anything that you wanted to include, or felt like you couldn't include within this book?
No, really. I mean, the only thing I can tell you is this, this is my 13th novel, and sometimes people think if you, as you get older, as you write maybe a number of books, things get easier, but it doesn't. My experience is you always struggle a lot as a writer. There are weeks when you feel like, okay, I got this. I have an amazing story. I'm on top of the world. And then the next week you're crawling on the floor because what you've written the week before is so bad. So you just have to start all over again. The only thing I learned over the years is that that's okay. That's part of the creative process. This is not linear. This is not a smooth transition. It's all right. Anxiety, panic attacks. Sometimes you feel depressed. That's all part of the story. But I really think as human beings, we are storytelling animals. We also are story remembering animals. What we remember from our own past, it's always connected to stories. No one said it better than Maya Angelou, right? She said, people will forget what you've said to them. They might even forget what you have done to them, but they will never forget how you made them feel. It's always the feelings that stay. There are very interesting studies that show if we go to a talk, if the talk is given via numbers, statistics, graphics, data, 24 hours later, we forget half of the talk. 3 days later, over 70% of the talk has evaporated. We will not remember it. But if the same talk has been given via stories, if the person who was talking was sharing their emotions, sharing their stories, 3 days later, 3 years later, we still remember. So there's a very direct relationship between memory, emotions, and the art of storytelling.
And before I open to questions, so get thinking, and if people online get those typed in, how do you hope people will feel having read this book?
It might sound maybe too idealistic, but I really believe in this because it happened to me. Books changed me so much. As I mentioned, I was an only child raised by a single working mom, and I thought life was so boring. It was books that showed me there were other possibilities. It connected me. Books connected me with other worlds, other forms of existence. And when I write a novel, I feel like by the time I finish, I'm slightly different. I'm a different person. Something has shifted in me. I've learned. I've changed. So if a reader can also experience something similar, that maybe they come and they say, I've learned something from your book, or I connected with this character, that really means the world to me. Because on paper you might say, oh, we all come from different boxes, we have nothing in common. And then we read the same book, we meet inside the same story, and then we realize our own shared humanity. So the ability to empathize, the ability to build bridges and connections, I think lies at the heart of the art of storytelling. That's something I very much believe in.
Oh, thank you, Elif. I'm
Thank
just going
you.
to now turn to questions from the audience. I'm hoping, given all the superfans that we have in the room, there will be lots of questions. If we do have questions, we just ask you to wait for the roaming mic, just so everybody online can hear your question, which I'm sure will be fantastic, so they can hear it as well. So did we have any questions in the room?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I was really struck by the way that you talked about the ways in which you'd written certain aspects of the book differently and how you were inspired by different storytelling traditions. And I was wondering if that fluidity changes your actual writing process, or whether or not you are much more kind of rigorous, or rigorous is probably the wrong word, but more kind of grounded and steady in the actual craft of putting the words on the paper.
Yeah, you're so kind. I'm never grounded and steady. So. But as you can hear in my accent, English is not my mother tongue. So this is an acquired language for me. English is my third language, and I'm writing as an immigrant. You feel like you're an immigrant, not only in this country, which has become my home, but also in this language, which also has become my home. But that said, it's always a struggle, because I think every immigrant knows what I'm talking about. When your whole existence is in a second or third language, the mind always runs faster than the tongue, and your tongue, in a clumsy way, tries to catch up and cannot. There's always a gap. That gap is very intimidating. You know, as immigrants, we always want to crack better jokes. We cannot quite get it right the way we want. You know, we hear the words we cannot pronounce. We doubt, did I say that right? Did I mispronounce? So that gap, that self-doubt is always there. But when I write fiction, I don't doubt in that sense. I just flow, you know, or I follow the flow of that river of writing. Does it make sense? So you just leave all those doubts outside, and then those characters become your friends. That story becomes your reality, and then I just can take off and fly. So I gave you a maybe longer answer, but it's not something that's very rational. There's room for irrationality. I think if you love what you do, that love becomes our guiding force. Thank you.
Elif, I'm just going to position a question from online, if I may.
Yes.
It's two parts. I'm going to ask the first part first. A political activist and successful novelist, is creative writing your way to bring to public notice and address political issues you feel strongly about?
Yeah, beautiful question, powerful question. You know, fiction is where my heart beats. I am a novelist, I'm a storyteller. That's all I am. And I have a lot of respect for people who are activists, who dedicate so much of their time. I wouldn't necessarily call myself an activist in that sense. You know, I would only call myself a writer, a storyteller. But that said, when you come from a wounded democracy, you do not have the luxury of saying, I don't want to talk about politics. You don't have the luxury of saying, I don't want to talk about what's happening outside the world, outside the window, when so much is happening outside the window, right? Also, I am a feminist. I've learned many wonderful things from past generations of women's movement. And of course, one of the crucial things for feminist practice was the redefinition of politics. So politics is not only what Keir Starmer said yesterday or what happened in the parliament a year before, it's bigger than that. Wherever there is power imbalance, there is politics. So the personal is also political, right? That's what you know, generations of feminism, feminist theory talked about. So my point is, you might be writing about sexuality, gender. That can also be a quite political work. You might be writing about trees. That can also be a political work. However, so there is always politics inside a novel. That it cannot be any other way. However, politics is never my guide or guiding force. I make a distinction. To be honest, I don't like it when writers try to preach or teach or try to lecture. I find it very, very off-putting. And I don't know the answers myself. The only thing I know is there are questions that I care about. I'm still thinking about these questions. So can we think together? Can we think about this together? So I think there's an important nuance there. A writer's job is never to try to dictate the answers, but to only and only bring these buried questions into the surface, then create an open space of nuance and pluralism, maybe have different opinions be heard, and then you take a step back. You have to leave the answers to the reader, because every reader is going to come up with their own answers. I know couples who have been married for 45 years. They read the same book. They don't read it in the same way. I know friends who share every little secret. They read the same novel. One of them loves it. The other one hates it. Why? Because the reader is not passive. Every reader brings their own gaze into the story, and I have to respect that diversity. So I don't like the kind of literature that preaches. I only like the kind of novels that dare to ask questions.
And thank you for that. And the second half of the question is, without the interest in these political topics, do you think you would still be a novelist? And if so, what kind of novel would you write?
You mean in the future?
Yeah.
Well, of course, none of us knows our futures. Everything is evolving. But I do know that the novel, as the long narrative form, is really where my heart beats. And in so many ways, this is the antidote of this age of hyper information, fast consumption, isn't it? And instant gratification. We live in an age in which our attention spans are declining, decreasing. I earlier mentioned these 2 TED Talks. The first TED Talk, very briefly, it was 20 minutes long. Those were the guidelines. Years later, the second TED Talk, the guidelines were, can you please keep it limited to 13 minutes, because we renewed our guidelines. I said, why? Because the world attention, span, average attention span has shrunk. That is very sad. So we're unable to listen to a talk that lasts 19 minutes. That says something about our psychology, about how we're conditioning, wiring our own brains. So what the novel does, the long form, remember there was this expectation that the novel was going to disappear. It will be the death of the novel, because now everything is too fast. It's the social media age. That is true, but the opposite is also happening. And I think what is happening is the faster this world spins, the more confusing it becomes, the more anxious we feel, the deeper our need to slow down. And there's a part of us that really wants to appreciate the trees, touch the trees. There's a part of us that wants to retreat into an inner garden, right? There's a part of us that is tired of this bombardment of snippets of information. It's too much. It's more than we can handle. And the truth is we're not processing it. So let us put aside this too much information and let us focus instead on knowledge and wisdom. And I really think for that we need the novel and we need art and literature.
I've got a question now. In terms of how do we push people to get the understanding of fiction and make it something that we should all be engaging with and all be consuming?
Yeah, I'm observing something, and this is what my personal observation, particularly in the last 2.5 years, because I do lots of literary events. I go to literary festivals, book events, up and down across the country and in different countries. More and more young people are coming to literary events. More and more young men are coming to fiction events, because usually fiction, there was always this perception that men of a certain generation would not read fiction. That is changing. Now in the big cities, in New York, in London, I'm sure you've come across this, there's this movement. They're organizing book reading parties. Like people are reading their phones for a few hours away. I think we are so tired. What this bombardment of information does is causing emotional fatigue, brain fatigue, and in the long run, it creates apathy, numbness, Then you just read snippets about Afghanistan, about this and that, and we don't really focus on anything. So coming back to your question, how do we maybe spread the love of storytelling? By talking about stories, by reminding ourselves and each other that we are storytelling creatures. This was always the case. This is a kind of art that is definitely older than us, bigger than us, and much, much wiser than us. That's why I think there's wisdom inside novels, not because writers are wise people. We're a mess, right? We really are. But when I'm writing, I feel like I tap into something that is older than me, and that is the ancient art of storytelling. From the very beginning, humanity has been telling stories. Let's pay attention to those politicians who are very successful today. Whether we like them or not, they are the ones who have a story to tell, right? Stories have power. In our jobs, in every moment of our lives, it's the stories that stay with us. So I think it's worth reminding ourselves of the importance of reading.
Definitely. Were there any more questions in the room? Or any more questions online? Oh, perfect.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I wanted to ask you about AI and sort of following on from decreasing attention spans and sort of getting people to read more. As an author, how do you feel about sort of the ongoing attack against creative industries by, or let's say, potential theft of content by AI sort of scraping? And as an author, what sort of have you thought about this? What sort of proposals would you, if you could create a policy, what would you say we should do. And, as lawyers, I guess there might be some IP lawyers among us.
Yeah.
So what would you do as if you were a policymaker in this area?
I really appreciate this question. It's so important, and I appreciate the work you do in this area, because it's so important, and it's going to become even more important, not only for writers, but for anyone in the creative industries. And of course, with the latest developments in America, it is very, very concerning. I personally would not want any tech company or any human being or any political party or any organization to have absolute power. We're all human beings. We're all fallible creatures. So extreme concentration of power, monopoly of power, it's a very dangerous thing. And this is happening in front of our eyes via tech companies right now. It is very alarming that the content, the books that we write, it takes such a long time to be able to write a book. There's so much work behind every book. All of that is taken without our consent. And these AI models are trained on them. There's also a lot of bias. That's another subject that we don't talk about, because most of the books that are used for AI training are actually very Eurocentric, right? So the stories of countries and cultures that don't fit into that model are also gone. So within the AI training, there's also bias. That's another layer we need to question. But very briefly, what I can say is, as you might have come across, we authors, we have been signing petitions, trying to organize grassroots movements, trying to make our voices heard by the people in power. But I really think it's very important that there be laws and obstacles, rules, preventing this from happening, whether it's the music industry or literature. It is not fair that the AI models are used in this way. And I think we need to also not be afraid of talking about these tech firms, because we think that technology is such a confusing subject that not many of us are able to talk about this. But I think in the public space, we need each other's voices. We need the voices of more young people, more women, more minorities talking about tech firms. Technology is way too important to leave it solely to tech firms, is what I'm trying to say.
Just going back to your book, which I've just read, absolutely loved, and it's such a pleasure to be here. So thank you so much. I wanted to go back to how you actually started to write the book. Did you have all three characters in mind straight away? Did you know that at the end, I don't want to spoiler alert, that there was going to be some kind of connection? How did you go about it? Was it all planned out? What's your how do you write? Tell us.
No, beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful question. I think there are two different ways of writing a novel. One is a bit more like, engineering, in which the author wants to know the structure, the plot, and how each and every character is going to behave. You want to plan it out. I have a lot of respect for authors who do this, but it's not my way. I like the second way, in which you follow your intuition. You're a little bit drunk. You don't quite know what you're doing. One thing leads to another. There's a flow, and you trust that flow. But for me to be able to feel that confidence, because it's a matter of confidence, right? You need to leap into the voids, the ether. For me to be able to feel confident, I need to do my homework well as a writer. So I really try to read a lot, research a lot. I want to know everything I can learn about these subjects. So you absorb, you filter. Also, we need to be good listeners. We need to listen to people and be open to learning, which means we need to sometimes unlearn. Because a big part of learning is also unlearning. There are stereotypes, cliches, biases that we internalize. So we need to also take those out. And then there comes a moment when I feel like, okay, from that moment onwards, I can fly, And then the characters slowly start to take shape, and they become my guides. And then one thing leads to another. So the water drop leads to the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh led me to George Smith. And George Smith led me to the other characters. That's why he's my oxygen, because he's at the center. But I did not plan everything. I just, in a way, followed them. They became my friends.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good, I think you've got time for one more question.
So I love your books, and I've never read a book where I've identified as being a second generation British person. And I always find when I finish your books, I regret not asking questions to my grandparents. How did we come here to the UK? What was your journey like? And through this book, you've said children from displaced families can never allow themselves to fall below level at which their parents started out. And that really resonated with me. And just wanted to know, how do you capture so beautifully that tension between homeland and new land, and where our hearts are, where our heads are? And did you do that from experience yourself as moving between different countries?
Yeah, such a beautiful question. Thank you so much. I think a lot about these concepts. Where is home? Can we have more than one home? Can we have multiple belongings? What is exile, right? All these concepts mean a lot to me. I think we do not forget our motherlands, even when we're miles and continents away. We carry them with us. You know, something remains with us and something remains behind. There's a melancholy to that. There's also enrichment, because you gain new things as well. So the dance of melancholy and maybe humor is something that really, really intrigues me. But very briefly, what you said is so true, and what I try to capture in the book. I've been observing through my experience and other people's experiences, so many immigrant families, we do not allow our children to fail, right? And this is true for any person who comes from a complex background or some minority experience, as if that child or that young person is representing something bigger than themselves. And if they fail, they're going to fail a whole community, a whole collective identity. That's a lot of pressure on the shoulders of a young person. Already it's hard to be young, right, for them. So we need to take that pressure off, but this is happening. And the second thing that I find very important is in many families that have experienced some kind of complexity, they have been almost deracinated, uprooted, and had to find their roots again. The older generation are usually the ones who have experienced the biggest hardships, but they don't talk about the past. They don't even know how to talk about it. It doesn't mean they have forgotten. It just sits inside their chest, unspoken. The second generation, in that sense, you're different. But usually the second generation, and I don't want to judge second generation, but they don't have the time for the past. They don't have the energy for the past, understandably, because they have to build a new life, tabula rasa. They need to be forward-looking, future-oriented. There is no time. But that leaves the third or the fourth generations in these families. The youngest in these families are the ones today who are asking the biggest questions about ancestral memory, ancestral heritage. They are the ones who are daring to ask, what happened to my great-grandparents? So they are digging deep into not only family stories, but also family silences. And I think in every family, there's at least one memory keeper. And I would like to hope that writers are the memory keepers of their own societies and their own times. We're not digging into memory in order to get stuck in the past, but to honor the past, to learn from the past, and hopefully never make the same mistakes again, but also bring the beauties of the past and the buried stories. So I'm very interested in people who are memory keepers of their own families. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for the questions, and thank you, Elif, for joining us today and
It's such a
sharing your
pleasure
book
for
and
me,
your
yeah.
stories and your insights. So I think we can end this session with a big round of applause.